when I thought about doing a presentation for this conference, I thought more carefully about the main theme that Vanessa just mentioned, which was this idea of moderation in times of crisis. And very quickly it dawned on me that the very definition of moderation, or the very etymology of moderation, there is a mention of the crisis, in the sense that moderation stems from the idea of trying to moderate or appease situations of excesses, be it in behavior or speech or any kinds of phenomena that need that kind of remediation. And indeed, it is highly used by platforms today, that is the context in which we speak of content moderation, to do exactly that, right? To deal with various kinds of crises, often to the sort of critique of platforms that sort of act very belatedly or retroactively to a series of crises that happen. Be that, for example, in misinformation or in collective behavior. And I previously mentioned the Capitol Hill riots. I'm half Brazilian, and I can also mention those that happened in Brasilia exactly a year after, almost to the date, and various other institutional crises, be them elections or political violence or you name it. And interestingly, moderation, if we really look at the history of moderation beyond the context that we're talking about today, which is, again, more sort of computational, social media-based content moderation, moderation as such, as a form of dealing with crisis, whatever they may be, has long existed in one way. And then in the scholarship, it tends to be tied in to the same sort of genealogy as censorship, because whether we want to admit it or not, normatively or not, it bears some sensorial practices, right? It consists in managing or modulating information in the public sphere. But in liberal democracies, particularly after the 50s, after the Second World War, moderation has mostly consisted in trying to manage information as an alternative to vertical censorship, right? In democracies that need to not resort, or that need to resort to censorship as the very last resort against a crisis. They use moderation as a form of modulating information more. So it's a little bit more subtle. So one example of that that's talked about in the United States in particular is counter-speech. But we can also see in the history of both legacy and new media, for example, television, newspapers, but also social media today, examples of marginalizing objectionable behavior, demotion techniques, or maybe putting something objectionable in the last page of a newspaper. That's essentially the same technique, or obfuscating it, or unbargaining it, or even just moderation, as Vanessa mentions it often, which is community management, right? So it's managing relations between people. That's also a form of moderation. At the same time, and this is where I turn back to the CFP theme, right? To the theme of this discussion. I think it's fair to say that moderation itself appears to be in crisis, in the sense that different platforms, user bases, and institutions tend to locate and define excesses in speech or behavior, right, or objectionable information in different ways. And that, in a sense, leads to a crisis in legitimacy from the moderators, particularly platforms, as well as, I think most importantly, a crisis in consensus on what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable speech. And often social media platforms have been sort of accused as being the stabilizing factor in that consensus, in the sense that there are some that criticize it for giving too much of a bigger platform to those that shouldn't have had it or didn't used to have it, arguably or allegedly, in legacy media. Right? And those people that have been re-platformed eventually through social media have very different ideas of what ought to be said in public or not. I think that's usually the sort of the parallel that we draw with new political actors, for example, Donald Trump in the United States, right? But at the same time, the other side of the aisle will say that platforms have also sort of facilitated a democratization of censorship, in the sense that both platforms and the political communities that inhabit those platforms are endowed with affordances to determine what they want their members to be able to say or not say in their own spaces. And that's how the notion of safe spaces or similar notions are sometimes uttered negatively. So the thing here about the role of consensus in moderation and the reason why it's so important is because what is considered problematic speech really stems, and this is something that Nancy Fraser, a political theorist, says, is that the notion of problematic speech really stems from ongoing dynamic public or legal or political deliberation or debate about what constitutes acceptable speech. And so naturally, the norms that derive from those debates, what we decide that can be said or cannot be said, are in constant negotiation and in constant tensions. But there is an important but there, that if there are really fundamental disagreements about what it is that we're allowed to say or not, and what that means, that arguably, and that's my point, that really can damage historical cohesion. And they can also balkanize public spheres into sort of competing counterspheres. One example of how this kind of consensus comes to be and why it's important is, I think, the process of denazification in Germany, whereby after the loss of the war by the Germans, they underwent a process of denazification of, let's say, sort of redefining the norms that they could use in public, of what to say, what not to say, what to believe, what not to believe. And then in that context, those norms were crystallized and, let's say, sort of enshrined in a new constitution that also came to forbid certain expressions to this day, right? So you're not allowed to, for example, show a Nazi sign in public. And that is a form of speech moderation that has some precedence in norms and some formalization in rules. And then there are a number of mechanisms, institutional, for example, like memorials or historical institutions, that are used to every day explain the reasons and the meaning of this kind of moderation. You go to a Holocaust memorial, you understand, why it's important not to utter anti-Semitic things in public, and so on and so forth. Now, the thing is, and this is where I get to the empirical bit of this research, is that with platforms and users, it's somewhat of a more difficult situation. And so the question is, how do they negotiate the boundaries of acceptable speech together? And so this project is kind of, it's about studying the ways in which platforms and users deliberate about that. And more specifically, what I do is that I compare YouTube and Twitter policies in relation to what their users think is acceptable to say or not. And then I use a variety of computational methods and close reading methods for that, colloquially called digital methods, that are particularly cultivated at the University of Amsterdam. So that's more empirical research that starts with a data set, which leads me to wish platform APIs to rest in peace, because this kind of research would not be possible to do today, given all the API changes. But nevertheless, two data sets. One is a big Twitter data set that's just 1 year old or 1 year long, and the other is even bigger YouTube data set that's goes from 2006 to 2022. And it's essentially just a lot of content where users debate moderation. So it's words like this is unacceptable, deplatforming, shadow banning, things like that. And just to catch up on time, I'm not going to go over this too much in detail, but essentially what I did is I had those data sets, then I filtered them with words that are relevant to this research question that I had. And then I perform a number of analyses on the comparison that I mentioned, right? To understand what platforms consider unacceptable and what users consider to be unacceptable. This is what's called computational linguistics. And I'll show you a number of examples of how that's done. And then on top of that, I also try to understand how YouTube in particular moderates content in relation to what users think they should have moderated instead. So I'll show you what this looks like. This is an example. So these are a number of edits of a variety of content moderation policies on YouTube over time, from 2006 until 22. And the point of this graph is to show how dynamic, indeed, the idea of what YouTube considers to be problematic is. So it begins, of course, with this big document until 2014, which is the community guidelines. And then from then on, given a number of events, particularly Gamergate, but also the sort of the rise of the so-called alt-right on the platform, they begin in collaboration with a variety of other platforms to complicate or kind of granulate more their content moderation policies, and new concepts of what is objectionable language begin to emerge. So you see things like, for example, specific ideas of borderline content, right? Things that are somewhat problematic or not, in combination with more traditional ideas of objectionable information, like hate speech or misinformation. And then as that happens, there's also complexification of content moderation techniques. So while before they tend to rely more on removal, suspension, or as another participant mentioned, users to report their own content, eventually they begin to use a combination of things. And today in particular, which is not something that the graph shows too well because it's cut out by 2022, they use demotion a lot, or what users like to call shadow banning. So it's bearing down content, search results or recommendation results, because it's much more dynamic and therefore much more adaptable to whatever users think is acceptable or not, right? You can turn it up or turn it down, whatever the norms of the day are, so to say. Again, to save time, I'm not going to go over this too much, but this is the equivalent of the graph before for Twitter. So these are a number of changes for Twitter's content moderation policies, and more or less the same story happens there. So it's a story of complexification of policies from 2016 onwards. And likewise, a complexification of techniques. So what you see over here is a variety of different content moderation techniques that are associated to different policies. And you'll see that some of them have more drastic measures, like violent content or life-threatening content, and others are a little bit more subtle, depending on the dynamic aspects of their activity. Right. So the world leaders policy is a little bit more lenient, but at the same time not really, because Donald Trump. So anyway, that there's, to get back to that point, a sense of plasticity in the norms that are treated here. So what about users? So just quickly, these are a number of times that users in YouTube comments mention terms that refer to problematic language. So this is just to give us an idea of what it is that they discuss when they discuss problematic language. And this is also applicable to other platforms that I looked at, but that I haven't put in this presentation for lack of time, which is that by far the biggest topic of concern when talking about problematic language is racism, particularly in 2018, in combination with abusive behavior, abusive language, discrimination, or offensiveness. But, and here comes kind of like the part of the research, is the way that things are defined as racist or differ. So what you're seeing in this graph here is the top 10 phrases or words that are most frequently mentioned to the word unacceptable in YouTube comments per year. So in this case, it's unacceptable ideological position, unacceptable racism, unacceptable innocent killings, and so on and so forth. And so it gives us an idea of what users don't necessarily believe is unacceptable, but tend to comment in relation to unacceptability. And what we notice first and foremost is that they mention things that are what I'd like to call constant extremes. So things that are that will tend to be the least acceptable things of all anyway. So the things that benefit from the most consensus as well about their unacceptability. So that's, as I said, violence, or particularly violence associated with terrorist groups around that time. So that's 2017 and 18. So the apex of the ISIS crisis in the Middle East. Later on, they also like to mention, and don't worry, I'll zoom in, unacceptable language. So these are more sort of variable extremes. So things that tend to be defined in different ways over time. So first, it's racism, Then it's blasphemy and abusive insulting, racial profiling, gender gay, anti-bigotry, discriminating, division and hate, unacceptable language, unacceptable hate speech, racism, sexism, bigotry, anti-Semitism. And this is the most interesting part, is that what they also comment as unacceptable is speech moderation itself. It's not just content that is moderated, it's also moderation as a practice. So first, around 2011 and 12, it's unacceptable, so internet chaos or free speech. And then later on, interrupting opponents, concealed censorship, safe space, risk space, classroom university, behavioral language. So all these debates about sort of deplatforming campuses and so on, particularly contextualized in the United States. So in that context, what do users say think speech should be moderated, particularly hate speech, as an example? Well, I think this picture kind of shows a little bit of the sort of the conflict or a conflictual aspect of that. So what you're seeing here is what's called a word tree. So the root of the word tree here is a sentence that is very frequently is mentioned in each and every line. Every line is a comment on YouTube, which means there are several numbers of comments that talk about hate speech being something. So a lot of, at least these dozen of comments tend to say that hate speech should be protected speech, where others would say that it's not free speech or not protected under certain laws, or that it is free speech, or it's never acceptable, or it is acceptable, or it's subjective, or it's illegal, and so on. So that, it gives you an impression of how much discordance there is under the hood about what we define as hate speech. And when we look at the degree to which users and platforms agree on what is moderated and not, this picture doesn't really do justice to the data. It needs a little bit, technically speaking, a little bit of adjustments. But what it shows is users that say that a video is offensive or a video is misinformative in comparison to what YouTube did with it. So these are content moderation banners, so to say, right? And that shows that if users think that a video is misinformative, it tends to be online. Sometimes it tends to be deplatformed or unavailable. Or if it's offensive, it tends to be also somewhat online. So there's some discordance there, but it's hard to say with this particular analysis that needs to be improved. And in this context, and here I'm about to finish, there is also a change in perspective of what YouTube as a platform, or platforms in general, are as public spaces. So as YouTube has a more interventionist approach to content moderation, it goes, users tend to mention YouTube, this is in 2011, as a great space to learn about whatever, or a great forum, way of doing that, or a tool, something just like sort of an open, transparent, public space, as we like to say 20 years ago. And now they mention it more as a private company or a social media platform that has obscure or partisan interests, or a joke or something like that. So as way towards conclusion, I think it's fair to say that what users and platforms consider to be unacceptable is of course dynamic and therefore often contradictory. And that by taking these rather unilateral content moderation decisions, users tend to portray platforms from open spheres to private actors with arbitrary decision making. And as a result, they tend to speak about from unacceptable speech to unacceptable ways of moderating speech. And this is, of course, to be expected. But I think that the emphasis here that I would like to bring in this presentation is that there's really a fundamental need to open intermediary spaces within platforms, such as in Reddit, where users and platforms or content moderators, for example, can deliberate and form a consensus about what it is that they define as objectionable language and how or whether it should be moderated. There are a number of initiatives in that direction, and I think that a lot of the things that have been mentioned in this conference have been very enriching to that direction. I'll stop here so I don't take too much of your time. Yeah, thanks so much for your attention.
I wonder, what your thinking is about how community managers or moderators, who have some agency over their space, let's assume they have that level of agency, how can they take up that mantle of that intermediary space? How can they kind of take action based on your final conclusion there and kind of work more transparently, have these discussions? What would you think about that? What advice might you give them?
I think two things. That first, as you mentioned, and as we also mentioned throughout this conference, there is a history of efforts like that. Right? I mean that there is, for example, possibilities or affordances to offer feedback for moderation. And now more recently, there are so, particularly after the Capitol Hill riots, I think efforts from Twitter that have been pioneered by Twitter before Elon Musk took over that he fortunately did not kill, at least not for now, to also give users agency in moderating. So resembling a model like that of Reddit. But I think there could be possibilities still, and I think of one example, which is Wikipedia. Sure, to what extent users can change content moderation policies on Wikipedia. So they have a number of charters, right, that they have to abide to and so on. But the very kind of infrastructure is one that relies constant back-end debating. So users are always on page edits, deliberating about whether this sentence is, what's the meaning, or does it still stand today, or what do we do about it, this happened, and things like that. And I think that this kind of infrastructure could be considered for social media platforms. In a sense, I think social media platforms could really appreciate more.
Gosh, that's really interesting. I think Wikipedia is such an interesting case study, and they've done a lot right over the years. They've had some, real challenges and faux pas as well, as you know. But I'm just trying to imagine their model wrapped around a Facebook, wrapped around an Instagram or a YouTube, and yeah, it would be really, really fascinating. I think I think Wikipedia and Reddit, they really do kind of lean to or adopt more of the community management side of this work, right? Where in terms of constitutionalizing this stuff with their users, really kind of approaching it as we recognize this space is a bit of a macro community. We also know we host sub communities within it. We're going to equip you and empower you, and then be in dialogue with you. Have these feedback loops about. The shared social contract we have and how that influences moderation and social norms and speech norms. And it is this kind of co-iterative process, in a way that, most of your major social platforms don't. So I think there's something really interesting there. And that is a traditional set of community management techniques that interestingly is being applied at that platform level. So I think there's definitely some more interesting cross-pollination maybe that could happen there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. And I think that in the history of platforms, they have tended from the start, right, throughout the history of Facebook and Twitter and so on, to be much more sort of centralized spaces. And I think that perhaps the way that moderation has been done for the past decade or so has been criticized by a number of users as such, right, in the sense that they could not participate always in the process of deciding what it is that is being moderated.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to just ask you about the next stages of your project. There's still further work to do. What is your sort of next step with your research? There's always work to do, but
as a fellow PhD researcher, well, I have to finish my PhD. I think that's like the
you and me both.
But also kind of applying the same research to other platforms at this point. Yeah, it's just a shame now that a lot of APIs have been closed down, because then it makes a lot of empirical content moderation research impossible.
So, yeah, oh no, it does. It's a real shame, the slamming of a lot of those doors. Listen, thank you so much for sharing all of your hard work. I'm really excited to look at your PhD and the conclusions that you come up with. We'll definitely stay in touch. Thank you for sharing everything. It's amazing. Love your work.
Thanks so much for that.
Thanks.
And thanks everyone for attending.